4-year-old beggar girl finds a wheelchair-bound man collapsed in the rain, but he's a millionaire, and days later. Drop a rating from 0 to 10 for my story in the comments. Your opinion is highly valued, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help means a lot. The rain lashed down on the dark asphalt of the sprawling, chaotic metropolis, creating rivulets that flowed through the trash-clogged gutters. Heavy drops hammered mercilessly against the torn awnings of businesses as the few pedestrians rushed for cover, completely ignoring the tiny figure huddled beneath the overhang of an abandoned storefront. The 4-year-old girl, who looked no older than 2 due to her extreme frailty, watched the people scurrying by with their colorful umbrellas and dry clothes. Her large, deep-set eyes reflected a profound sadness that shouldn't exist in someone so young. The dirty, tattered dress she wore offered little protection from the damp cold that seeped into her fragile bones. For 2 years, she had known these unforgiving streets, learning to survive on scraps of food found in restaurant dumpsters and the occasional kindness of strangers who pitied her situation. Each day was a silent battle for survival, a fight she waged alone against a world that seemed to have forgotten her existence. On this particularly violent, stormy afternoon, something different caught her attention. Across the street, near a sleek office building, she saw a man lying on the wet ground. Next to him was a wheelchair, overturned and soaked by the rain. The man, who appeared to be in his early 30s, was trying to drag himself along the slippery sidewalk with desperate movements. Even from a distance, it was clear that he was strikingly handsome, features that resembled a soap opera heartthrob with the physique of a movie idol. His dark hair was completely soaked, plastered to his face, which expressed a mixture of physical pain and emotional despair. The expensive clothes, now wet and soiled, revealed that he was not accustomed to this state of vulnerability. The girl watched for a few minutes, seeing other people pass by without offering help. Some even stopped to look, but moved on when they realized the complexity of the situation. The rain continued relentlessly, and the man remained there, struggling against his own physical condition and the weight of the wheelchair he couldn't reposition on his own. Without thinking about the consequences or her own safety, the little girl left her makeshift shelter. Her bare feet stepped into icy puddles as she crossed the deserted street, approaching the stranger in distress. The rain beat against her small, thin face, but she showed no hesitation. "Do you need help?" she asked with a weak voice, almost inaudible above the noise of the storm. The man looked up, surprised to see this frail child standing beside him. For a moment he seemed confused, as if he couldn't process that someone had stopped to help him, especially a girl who clearly had her own problems to solve. I fell out of my chair," he explained, his voice choked with emotion and physical effort. "I can't get back up on my own." Without a word, the girl positioned herself beside the wheelchair. With her limited strength, she began to push it, trying to get it into the upright position. The man watched her in disbelief, seeing this malnourished and fragile child struggling to help him when all the well-dressed and healthy adults had simply ignored his situation. After a few minutes of joint effort, they managed to position the chair correctly. The girl then offered her small hands to help him get up from the wet ground. The process was slow and painful, but finally, the man managed to transfer himself back into his wheelchair. Breathing heavily, he reached into his pockets and found some coins. He held them out to the girl, who looked at the money for a moment before shaking her head negatively. "I just wanted to help," she said simply, stepping back. The man was completely speechless. In his 30 years of life, accustomed to a world where everything had a price and where people always expected something in return, he had never experienced such pure intentions. Tears mixed with the rainwater on his face, creating a moment of profound emotion that struck him like lightning. "What's your name?" he asked, still trying to process what had just happened. But when he looked up again, The girl had already disappeared into the rainy darkness of the afternoon, leaving him alone with his wheelchair and a completely new feeling growing in his chest. For the first time in months, something beyond pain and despair had touched his soul. That night, as the storm finally subsided, he stayed awake thinking about the mysterious girl who had appeared like an angel in the midst of the chaos of his destroyed life. Something had changed within him, a small flame of hope that he hadn't felt since the day his life had completely fallen apart. The following days passed like a haze of unease for the 30-year-old man. Inside his luxurious penthouse apartment in the city's most upscale neighborhood, he moved through the mechanical routine that his life had become since the accident that changed everything. The fortune accumulated over the years through precise investments in the stock market seemed to have no meaning in the face of the emptiness that consumed his existence. His mornings always started the same way. He would wake up in the middle of the afternoon, transfer himself from the bed to the wheelchair with automated movements, and spend hours looking out the panoramic window that offered a privileged view of the metropolis. The dollar fortune he had built through smart investments and lucrative deals couldn't buy what he wanted most: the ability to turn back time and prevent the tragedy that destroyed his family. But since the encounter with the girl in the rain, something different disturbed his mind. The image of those large, sad eyes, the way she had approached without fear or financial interest, constantly returned to his thoughts. For 3 consecutive days, he drove his adapted car to the place where they had met, looking for her in the vicinity. The bustling commercial area didn't seem like the kind of place where a street child would stay for long. The security guards of the establishments and the constant presence of local authorities usually drove the homeless to less monitored areas. He had to expand his search to find clues about the little girl's whereabouts. It was on the 4th day of searching that he saw her again. He was driving slowly through the adjacent streets when he spotted a tiny figure walking near a bridge that crossed a polluted river. He immediately recognized the frail movements and the hunched posture of the girl who wouldn't leave his thoughts. He stopped the vehicle and watched her from a distance. She was carrying a torn plastic bag where she apparently kept her few belongings. Her steps were slow and tired, as if each movement was an immense effort for her malnourished body. When she disappeared under the bridge, he understood that he had discovered where she lived. The space beneath the concrete structure was a completely different world from the one he knew. The smell of dampness and sewage mixed with the odors of spoiled food and accumulated garbage. Several homeless people had created makeshift shelters with cardboard, tarps, and pieces of metal. Among them, he found the girl sitting alone in an isolated corner. She had built a kind of tent using cardboard boxes and plastic bags, creating a space that could barely protect her from the elements. When she saw him approaching in his wheelchair, her eyes showed surprise but not fear. It was as if she had a natural ability to recognize people's intentions. "Were you looking for me?" she asked, tilting her head slightly with childish curiosity. "I was," he admitted, feeling a pang in his chest as he saw the precarious conditions in which she lived. "I wanted to thank you for what you did for me that day." In the days that followed, a peculiar routine developed between them. Every afternoon he would arrive at the location with his wheelchair, bringing hot food and clean water. He would sit next to the girl's makeshift shelter, and they would talk about simple things: the birds that flew over the river, the clouds that formed shapes in the sky, the people who passed over the bridge above them. She spoke little about her past, but gradually revealed fragments of her story. She said she didn't remember her parents very well, only a woman who claimed to be her guardian but had abandoned her there 2 years ago, promising to return and never appearing again. The girl had learned to survive on her own, developing a precocious maturity that contrasted painfully with her fragile appearance. During these conversations, he carefully avoided revealing his true financial situation. He wore simple clothes when he went to visit her, drove an ordinary car borrowed from an employee, and spoke about himself vaguely. He didn't want her to know about the fortune he possessed, about the stock investments that generated monthly dividends enough to support dozens of families, or about the luxurious apartment where he lived, isolated from the world. The girl's presence began to fill a void that he didn't know existed. For years, he had focused only on accumulating wealth, expanding his businesses, and increasing his net worth. After the accident that took his wife and his mobility, he had plunged into a deep depression that money couldn't cure. But this child, with her purity and her ability to find joy in the small things, was slowly warming his frozen heart. She never asked for anything beyond his company. When he offered more food or clothes, she accepted them with genuine gratitude, but never greedily. There was a dignity in her poverty that deeply impressed him. The girl had lost everything, but she maintained a natural kindness that many privileged people never possessed. 3 months passed in this comforting routine. He had regained a purpose to leave the house, a reason to wake up earlier and plan his day. The girl, in turn, seemed less thin and a little less fragile, as if the regularity of food and constant company were making a difference in her health. But it was during the 12th week of coexistence that he noticed something worrying. The girl began to experience episodes of fever that lasted for days. She tried to hide her condition, not wanting to worry him, but it was impossible to ignore the tremors that shook her small body and the excessive paleness that covered her face. One morning, when he arrived for his daily visit, he found her so weak that she could barely sit up. Her breathing was irregular, and her lips had turned a bluish color that deeply alarmed him. It was obvious that she needed urgent medical care, but when he suggested taking her to the hospital, she vehemently refused, explaining that people like her were not welcome in places like that. That night he couldn't sleep, tormented by the image of the sick girl in her precarious shelter. For the first time in months, he considered revealing his true identity and using his fortune to ensure that she received proper treatment. But he knew that this would completely change the dynamic between them, and he was afraid that she would see him as just another rich man trying to buy his own peace of mind. The dilemma consumed him as he watched the sunrise through the window of his luxurious apartment, knowing that on the other side of the city, a child who had become precious to him was fighting a disease that his money could easily cure. The situation changed drastically when a figure from the past reappeared unexpectedly. It was a rainy Thursday when he arrived at the usual location and found a woman of approximately 45 years talking to the girl in a seemingly friendly way, but which provoked a visible terror in the child's eyes. The woman had dark hair tied in a messy bun, worn but clean clothes, and a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. When she noticed his presence, her behavior changed instantly, adopting a more interested and observant posture. "You must be the man my daughter told me about," she said, extending her hand with false cordiality. "I'm her guardian. It's good to know that someone has been taking care of the little one during my absence." The girl remained silent, but her whole body was trembling in a way he had never witnessed before. It was obvious that the presence of that woman awakened painful memories and a deep fear that went far beyond what a child should experience. "Your daughter?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral while processing this disturbing information. "Stepmother, actually," the woman corrected with a smile that seemed more like a threat. "But I have legal responsibility for her. I had to be away for urgent family matters in another city, but now I'm back to pick her up." The girl cringed even more, instinctively moving closer to his wheelchair as if seeking protection. Her large eyes silently pleaded for him not to let her go with that woman, but he found himself in a delicate position, without legal rights or authority to interfere in the situation. "She doesn't seem to want to go with you," he carefully observed, trying to assess the woman's reaction. "Children are sometimes stubborn," the stepmother replied in a tone that sounded false and forced. "But she knows she needs to come with me. After all, I have financial obligations to meet, and she can help." The way she mentioned financial obligations and the girl's ability to help set off alarms in his mind. It was obvious that that woman hadn't returned out of love or genuine concern for the child's well-being. During the following days, the situation became dramatically complicated. The woman didn't take the girl away immediately, but started appearing regularly at the location, observing the interactions between them and asking increasingly direct questions about his financial situation. "I see you have a nice car," she commented on one of those occasions, examining the vehicle he had parked near the bridge. "And your clothes, even though they're simple, seem to be of good quality. You must have a comfortable situation." He tried to minimize his financial condition, but the woman was persistent and observant. She started making comments about how expensive it was to take care of a sick child, about the medical expenses she was facing, and about how it would be fair for someone who showed so much interest in the girl to contribute to those costs. The first direct demand came one morning when the girl was particularly weak, with a high fever and difficulty breathing. The stepmother appeared with a determined expression and a proposal that sounded more like a threat. "I need $500 for her medical expenses," she said bluntly. "I know you can help, and if you really care about her, you'll want to make sure she gets the proper treatment." He found himself in an impossible position. Refusing meant potentially leaving the girl without medical care, but accepting would set a dangerous precedent. He decided to pay, hoping it was an isolated case, and that the woman would actually use the money to take care of the child. But it was only the beginning. Every week the demands increased. First it was expensive medications, then specialized medical exams, then clothes and special food. The woman always presented elaborate justifications, but never showed receipts or evidence that the money was being used for the girl's well-being. What disturbed him most was realizing that the child's condition didn't improve, despite the supposed investments in her health. If anything, she seemed to be getting weaker and more frightened with each encounter. There was a new sadness in her eyes, a resignation that didn't exist before the stepmother returned. During this period, he also began to face his own internal demons. The routine of caring for the girl had been a welcome distraction from the deep depression that had consumed him since the accident. But now, seeing himself blackmailed and manipulated, feelings of anger and helplessness that he had tried to suppress returned with full force. The nights became endless cycles of insomnia and guilt. His luxurious apartment, with a view of the illuminated city, seemed like a golden prison where he ruminated about his choices. The wealth accumulated over the years through smart investments in funds and stocks seemed useless in the face of the complex situation he found himself in. The fortune he possessed could easily solve the financial problems that the stepmother claimed to have, but he began to suspect that fueling this situation would only make things worse. It was obvious that the woman had identified him as a source of income and had no intention of stopping the exploitation. The breaking point came when she drastically increased her demands, demanding an amount equivalent to several months' salary for an average person. She claimed that the girl needed urgent surgery and that he, as the only one interested in her well-being, should bear all the costs. "If you really care about her, you'll find a way to get that money," the stepmother said with a cruel smile, "because if you don't, I'll have to look for other people willing to help. And you know, there are plenty of people interested in pretty and obedient girls like her." The implied threat made his blood run cold. It was obvious that the woman was suggesting something terrible, using the child's vulnerability as a weapon of blackmail. At that moment, he understood that he wasn't just dealing with greed, but with a truly dangerous person. That night, alone in his apartment, he made a decision that would change everything. He could no longer pretend to be just an ordinary man with limited resources. The situation had escalated beyond his ability to control it through half measures. It was time to use all his financial power and his connections to protect the girl, even if it meant revealing his true identity and facing the consequences of that revelation. But first, he needed to ensure that the girl was safe. And to do that, he would have to find a way to get her definitively out of the hands of that dangerous woman. The millionaire's life took a completely unexpected turn when, 3 days after his decision to protect the girl at all costs, he received a call that would change everything again. It was from his personal attorney, informing him of a court decision that had been made without his prior knowledge. "Your wife's parents have filed a petition in court," the attorney explained with a grave voice. "They want your daughter to come back and live with you. They claim that you've had enough time to recover from the accident and that the child needs to be with her father." The news hit him like a lightning bolt. During the 2 years that followed the tragedy that took his wife and his ability to walk, his 4-year-old daughter had remained with her maternal grandparents in a town upstate. He had agreed to the temporary arrangement, recognizing that he wasn't in an emotional state to care for a child while fighting his own depression and adapting to his new physical reality. "When is this going to happen?" he asked, trying to process how this change would affect his already complex situation with the beggar girl. "The court order stipulates that she must be back with you by the end of this week. The grandparents are already making preparations to bring her." He hung up the phone in shock. For months, his life had revolved around the daily visits to the girl under the bridge. She had become his purpose, his reason for getting out of bed every morning. Now, suddenly, he would have to divide his attention and energy between 2 4-year-old children, each with their own urgent needs. The luxurious penthouse apartment that had become his isolated refuge would need to be transformed to accommodate a child. The room that had remained untouched since the accident, still decorated with the toys and children's furniture chosen by his wife, would have to be reopened. The mere thought of entering that space made his chest tighten with an almost unbearable pain. When the girl arrived, brought by her grandparents on a sunny afternoon, the tension in the apartment was palpable. She had grown during the 2 years of separation, but still retained her mother's eyes and some of her characteristic gestures that cut through his heart like sharp blades. "Daddy," she said timidly, staying close to her grandparents as if seeking security. It was obvious that she also felt uncomfortable with the situation, accustomed to the stable and loving routine she had found in her grandparents' house. The first days were an emotional disaster for both of them. He didn't know how to interact with his own daughter, having lost the practice of fatherhood during the period of mourning and isolation. She, in turn, found the luxurious but cold environment of the apartment strange, missing the constant attention and affection she received from her grandparents. The meals were silent and uncomfortable. He tried to make conversation, but couldn't find appropriate subjects for a 4-year-old child. She responded with monosyllables, clearly feeling lost in the immense apartment where only their own voices echoed. What disturbed him most was realizing that his daughter had developed a precocious independence during his absence. She didn't ask for help with anything, didn't seek physical affection, and seemed to have learned not to expect much from the adults around her. It was as if she had built an emotional wall to protect herself from further abandonment. During this chaotic period of adaptation, he found himself unable to maintain his regular visits to the beggar girl. For 3 consecutive days, he couldn't leave the apartment, divided between the guilt of neglecting the child who had become so important to him and the responsibility of trying to rebuild a relationship with his own daughter. When he finally managed to escape for a quick visit to the location under the bridge, he found the girl in an even worse state. The fever had intensified, she could barely stand, and the cruel stepmother was more aggressive and demanding than ever. "I thought you had disappeared," the woman said with a sarcastic smile, "but I imagine you've been busy counting your money somewhere comfortable. Well, the situation here has gotten worse. She needs intensive care now, and that's going to cost a lot more than we've been discussing." The new financial demand was astronomical, clearly an attempt to extort an amount that would completely change the stepmother's life. But what alarmed him most was the girl's physical state. She was visibly thinner. Her eyes had lost that sparkle of hope that they had always maintained even in the worst situations, and there was a resigned acceptance in her posture that deeply frightened him. "What have you done to her?" he asked, unable to hide his growing anger. "Me? Nothing but take care of her as best I can with the limited resources I have," the woman replied with cynicism. "But if you're suggesting I can do better, then you need to contribute appropriately to it." That night, back at the apartment, he faced a scene that emotionally destroyed him. His daughter had found a photograph of her mother that he kept hidden in a drawer. She was sitting on the floor of the room, holding the photo and crying silently. "I miss Mommy," she said when she saw him standing at the door. "Grandma and Grandpa said she went to heaven, but I don't understand why she can't come back." He approached slowly, his own heart breaking as he saw his daughter's suffering. For the first time since her return, she allowed him to hug her, and they stayed like that for long minutes, sharing a pain that neither of them knew how to properly process. "Daddy misses her too," he admitted, realizing that he had been so focused on his own pain that he hadn't adequately considered the trauma that the child was also facing. It was during this intimate conversation that she asked a question that left him completely speechless. "Daddy, why don't you stay home anymore?" "The housekeeper said you leave every day to meet someone." The question revealed that his daughter had noticed his constant absences, probably interpreting them as another sign that he didn't want to be near her. The guilt he felt multiplied exponentially, creating an internal conflict that threatened to tear him completely apart. That morning, as his daughter finally slept in her own bed for the first time in 2 years, he remained awake, facing the brutal reality of his situation. He had 2 4-year-old girls who desperately needed his attention and care, but in completely different ways. One was his legal and emotional responsibility as a father. The other had become his moral responsibility through the love he had developed for her. The cruel stepmother had perceived his vulnerability and was intensifying the pressure, knowing that he was divided and emotionally fragmented. The financial demands continued to escalate, but now he knew that simply paying wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. The girl needed to be permanently removed from that dangerous situation. But how to do that without further neglecting his own daughter, who had already suffered enough abandonment for a lifetime? The situation deteriorated rapidly when his daughter began to show worrying signs that something was deeply wrong at home. During breakfast one Tuesday, she pushed her plate away and declared that she didn't want to eat anything anymore. "I'm not hungry," she said, crossing her small arms in a gesture of defiance that he had never seen before. "You need to eat to grow strong," he tried, using the tone that reminded him of his wife, but that sounded forced and artificial coming from him. "What for? You're not even here," she replied with a cruel maturity that hit him like a knife. "You always leave to meet someone more important." The accusation in her childish voice revealed how much his constant absences were affecting her. During the 2 weeks that followed the girl's return, he had tried to maintain some balance between his responsibilities, but he was failing miserably on both fronts. The visits to the beggar girl had become sporadic and hurried. When he managed to escape for a few hours, he found her in increasingly poor condition. The cruel stepmother had realized his divided situation and was using it to her advantage, intensifying the psychological and financial pressure. "I see you have other priorities now," the woman had commented during his last visit, observing his haste and nervousness. "But remember that commitments are commitments, and this girl won't survive much longer without proper care." The implied threat in her voice was clear. If he didn't continue paying the exorbitant amounts she demanded, Something terrible would happen to the child who had become so precious to him. But at the same time, his own daughter was clearly suffering from his emotional and physical absence. The crisis escalated when he arrived home after one of those tense visits and found his daughter in the room, systematically breaking the objects that had belonged to her mother. Small picture frames, jewelry boxes, and carefully preserved mementos were scattered on the floor in pieces. "What are you doing?" he shouted, louder than he intended, scaring the girl, who immediately stopped and cowered in the corner of the room. "I hate these things," she said, tears streaming down her small face. "They make you sad and leave the house. If I break everything, maybe you'll stay here with me." The childish logic behind the destruction was devastating. His daughter had identified the memories of her mother as competition for his attention and was trying to eliminate them in the only way she knew how. It was a desperate cry for love and presence that he had been completely ignoring. That night, after cleaning up the wreckage and putting his daughter to sleep after a long conversation about feelings and loss, he locked himself in his office and faced the brutal reality of his situation. He was failing as a father and as a protector. His daughter was developing serious behavioral problems, while the beggar girl was wasting away under the care of the cruel stepmother. The wealth accumulated over the years through careful investments in stocks and financial applications seemed completely useless in the face of his inability to solve the emotional problems he faced. All the money in the world couldn't buy the ability to be in two places at the same time, or to heal the deep wounds that both girls carried. It was during that sleepless night that he made a desperate decision. He called a childcare agency and hired a professional nanny to stay with his daughter during the day. It was a temporary and imperfect solution, but it would allow him to dedicate more time to the critical situation of the beggar girl. The nanny, who arrived the next morning, was an experienced woman of 50, with impeccable references and a natural maternal approach that his daughter received with cautious interest. For the first time in weeks, he managed to leave home without feeling that he was completely abandoning his paternal responsibility. But when he arrived at the location under the bridge, he discovered that the situation had changed dramatically. The beggar girl wasn't in her usual shelter. In her place, he found only the cruel stepmother, with a triumphant expression that immediately alerted him to the danger. "She's in a safe place," the woman said, even before he asked. "A place where she's receiving the care she needs. But continuing to receive that care will depend on you fulfilling your obligations." "Where is she?" he demanded, feeling panic rising in his chest. "Somewhere where generous people take care of needy children," she replied with a cruel smile. "But those people also have expenses, very specific expenses that need to be covered regularly." The realization that the girl had been taken to some kind of even more dangerous situation hit him like a punch in the stomach. The stepmother had escalated the game, removing the child from his sight to have total control over the situation. "How much do you want?" he asked, deciding it was time to stop pretending he had limited resources. "Now we're speaking the same language," she said, her eyes gleaming with greed. $50,000 a month, every month, no delays, no excuses. The amount was absurd, clearly an attempt to extort an amount that would completely change the woman's life. But what alarmed him most was the implication that this would be a permanent arrangement. She wasn't asking for money to return the girl. She was establishing a blackmail system that could last indefinitely. "And if I don't pay?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. "Then she'll disappear forever. And there are plenty of people interested in pretty and obedient girls like her, people who pay well for companionship." The explicit threat made his blood run cold. It was obvious that the stepmother was connected to a network of people who exploited vulnerable children. The girl he had saved from the rain months ago was now in the hands of predators who would see her only as merchandise. At that moment, all the wealth he had accumulated through smart business deals and investments in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies finally had a clear purpose. It was no longer a question of charity or kindness. It was a battle for the life and dignity of an innocent child. "I'll pay," he said, his voice cold and determined. "But I want to see her regularly. I want assurances that she's well and safe." "Of course," the stepmother replied with false sympathy. "You can visit her once a week, but only if the payments are up to date." When he returned home that afternoon, he found his daughter playing peacefully with the nanny for the first time in weeks, showing something close to contentment. The irony of the situation didn't go unnoticed. He had hired someone to take care of his daughter so that he could save another child, creating a chain of responsibilities that was becoming increasingly complex. That night, as he watched his daughter sleep peacefully, he made a silent oath. He would use all his fortune, all his connections, all his power to find a way to destroy the network that had captured the beggar girl. But first, he would need to find out exactly where she was being held and who else was involved in this cruel operation. The game had completely changed, and now he was playing for the life of a child who had become his most important moral responsibility. The frenzied search for the beggar girl began immediately. Using his vast network of business contacts and the resources that his fortune provided, he discreetly hired private investigators specializing in missing persons cases. Each day that passed without news intensified his despair and his determination. For 2 consecutive weeks, he lived a distressing double existence. In the morning, he tried to maintain a normal appearance for his daughter, having breakfast together and talking about everyday subjects. But the tension in his movements and the constant distraction didn't go unnoticed by the 4-year-old, who began to ask increasingly direct questions. "Daddy, are you sad again?" she asked one morning, watching him distractedly stir the food on his plate without eating anything. "I'm just worried about some things at work," he lied, forcing a smile that didn't fool anyone. "Is it because of the girl?" she said suddenly, causing him to almost drop his coffee cup. "What girl?" he asked, trying to sound casual while his heart raced. "The girl you go see when you leave the house. I heard you talking on the phone about her." The revelation that his daughter had noticed his secrets left him deeply disturbed. During the months of interacting with the beggar girl, he had been careful to keep the 2 parts of his life completely separate. Now he discovered that separation had only been an illusion. That afternoon, while his daughter was with the nanny, he received a call from one of the investigators he had hired. The news was both encouraging and terrifying. "We've located the child," the man said with a grave voice. "She's being kept in a house in the suburbs of the city. But the situation is more complicated than we initially imagined." "How so?" he asked, gripping the phone tightly. "The house functions as a kind of informal shelter for street children, but there are signs that some of these children are being used for questionable activities, forced begging mainly. The woman you know as the girl's stepmother is just an intermediary in a larger operation." The revelation that there was an organized network exploiting vulnerable children turned his anger into something much more dangerous. It wasn't just about saving one child. It was necessary to dismantle an entire system that caused suffering to dozens of helpless minors. "Can I see her?" he asked. "Not yet. We're observing the house, mapping who comes and goes, trying to understand the extent of the operation. If you show up now, you could compromise everything and put the girl in even greater danger." During the days that followed, he lived a hell of anxiety. He knew that the girl was only a few miles away, probably scared and confused, but he couldn't do anything but wait for the investigators to develop a safe plan to get her out of there. It was during this time of agonizing waiting that his daughter made a decision that completely surprised him. One afternoon when he was particularly agitated, pacing back and forth in the apartment like a caged animal, she approached him with unusual determination. Daddy, I want to help you find the girl, she said, her voice small but firm. How do you know about... he began, but she interrupted him. I know you're suffering because of her, just like I suffer when I miss Mommy. And if she's important to you, then she's important to me too. The emotional maturity demonstrated by a 4-year-old left him speechless. For weeks, he had tortured himself trying to balance his responsibilities, thinking he needed to choose between the two girls. Now, his own daughter was offering a solution that he hadn't even considered, joining forces instead of competing for his attention. What do you think we can do? He asked, crouching down to her height. When we find her, we can take care of her together. Like she was my sister, she said with the simplicity that only children possess to solve complex problems. At that moment, something fundamentally transformed inside him. For months, he had been so focused on his own guilt and internal conflicts that he hadn't considered that his daughter could be an ally instead of an additional complication. The idea of creating an extended family where both girls could receive love and care suddenly seemed not only possible, but inevitable. 3 days later, the investigator called with news that changed everything again. We have a problem, he said bluntly. The girl is sick, very sick. Our source inside the house says she's had a high fever for several days and can barely get up. What kind of illness? He asked, feeling panic rising in his chest. We don't know for sure, but from the symptoms described, it could be something cardiac. She needs urgent medical care, but the people keeping her don't want to draw attention by taking her to a hospital. The revelation that the girl was slowly dying while he was prevented from helping her pushed him to the limit of his emotional endurance. That night, after putting his daughter to bed, he locked himself in his office and made the riskiest decision of his life. He called the cruel stepmother and made a proposal that would change everything. I want to double the monthly payment, he said when she answered, but in return, I want to see her immediately, and I want her to receive proper medical treatment. Interesting, the woman replied, clearly pleased with the desperation in his voice. Very interesting. It seems you finally understand the seriousness of the situation. Where is she? He asked directly. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. in Central Park. Come alone, bring the money in cash, and you can see her for a few minutes. When he hung up the phone, he knew he was walking straight into a trap. But he also knew he had no choice. The girl who had changed his life was dying, and every hour of delay could be the difference between saving her and losing her forever. That morning, while preparing the money he would take to the meeting, he wrote a letter to his daughter explaining where he had gone in case something went wrong. It was a grim acknowledgement that he was about to enter a dangerous situation from which he might not return. But some battles were worth any risk, and saving an innocent child was definitely one of them. The meeting in Central Park was a moment that changed everything irreversibly. When he arrived at the marked location, driving his adapted car through the tree-lined avenues, he immediately realized that he wasn't alone. Several people scattered throughout the park seemed to be watching discreetly, creating an atmosphere of surveillance that made his survival instincts kick in. The cruel stepmother was sitting on a bench near the children's playground, with a relaxed posture that contrasted drastically with the tension he felt. Next to her, almost hidden by the shadow of a large tree, was the beggar girl, and the sight of her left him completely shocked. During the weeks of separation, the child had deteriorated alarmingly. Her skin was pale with a sickly yellowish tinge. Her large eyes seemed even larger in a face that had lost all its childish fat. She was wearing clean clothes, but they were huge on her frail body, as if they had been chosen for a much larger child. She's fine, as you can see, the stepmother said as he approached, but her defensive tone revealed that she knew perfectly well that the girl was in terrible condition. She needs to go to the hospital immediately, he said, unable to disguise the urgency in his voice. Anyone can see she's seriously ill. Doctors ask too many questions, the woman replied with cruel indifference, and hospitals have records. It's better for all of us to avoid that kind of official attention. While they talked, he watched the girl closely. She recognized him immediately, her eyes lighting up slightly despite her weakened condition. But when she tried to speak, only a weak whisper came from her lips, and she began to cough in a way that alarmed him deeply. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, feeling anger growing in his chest. "A few days." "Nothing much. Kids get sick sometimes," the stepmother lied, avoiding his direct gaze. It was at this moment that the girl tried to get up from the bench, clearly wanting to approach him, but her legs failed completely. She collapsed to the ground like a rag doll, unconscious and with irregular breathing. The sight of the child fainting at his feet was the trigger that completely destroyed his capacity for rational negotiation. "We're going to the hospital now," he declared, moving his wheelchair towards the girl. "You can't do that," the stepmother protested, rising quickly. "She's under my legal responsibility." "Your legal responsibility doesn't include letting her die," he replied with a coldness he had never felt before. "And if you try to stop me, you'll find that a man with unlimited resources can be very dangerous when a child is at risk." The threat implied in his words, combined with the absolute determination in his voice, made the woman recoil slightly. She looked around the park, as if seeking support from the people he had noticed watching, but suddenly all those shadowy figures seemed to have disappeared. With extreme care, he picked up the girl, transferring her from the wheelchair to the back seat of his car. She was hot with fever, but her breathing was so weak that he had to put his ear close to her face to be sure she was still alive. "You're going to regret this," the stepmother shouted as he prepared the car to leave. "She belongs to me, and I'm going to seek my rights." "Try it," he replied, starting the engine. "But know that now you're dealing with someone who has the resources to fight for a long time, and in many different ways." The race to the most exclusive hospital in the city was an agonizing experience. The girl remained unconscious throughout the journey, her breathing becoming increasingly irregular. He drove with desperate precision, using connections on his cell phone to alert the medical staff about his imminent arrival. When they arrived at the hospital, a full team of pediatricians and cardiologists was already waiting. The power of his wealth and influence ensured that the girl received immediate attention and all the necessary exams, without complicated questions about paperwork or legal responsibility. The first hours in the hospital were a nightmare of uncertainty. He remained in the waiting room, using his wheelchair to circulate nervously through the luxurious space, while doctors entered and left the room where the girl was fighting for her life. It was during this agonizing vigil that his daughter arrived, brought by the nanny who had received instructions to meet him at the hospital if he didn't return home at the usual time. "Daddy, how is she?" asked his daughter, demonstrating a genuine concern that surprised him. "The doctors are taking care of her," he replied, picking her up and feeling an unexpected comfort in having his family close during that terrible moment. "Is she going to be okay?" the girl insisted, her large eyes fixed on the door of the room where the other child was being treated. "Let's hope so," he said, realizing that his daughter had developed a protective interest in the beggar girl even without ever having met her personally. When the chief doctor finally came out of the room, his expression was grave but not hopeless. He approached them with measured steps, carrying test results that would define the girl's future. "The situation is serious," he began, "but not impossible to treat. She has a congenital heart condition that has been severely aggravated by malnutrition and medical neglect. Without immediate treatment, she would have very little time to live. But can it be treated?" he asked, holding his daughter's hand that had tightened around his. "Yes, but it will require complex and expensive surgery, very expensive, and a long period of recovery with intensive care," the doctor explained. "We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in treatment." "Money is no object," he replied immediately. "Do everything that is necessary." Use the best specialists available. Import equipment if needed. I want her to have access to the best medical treatment that money can buy." That night, while the girl slept sedated in a pediatric ICU room surrounded by the best medical equipment available, he and his daughter made a silent pact. Regardless of what happened with the complex legal situation that loomed, both girls were now part of the same family. The battle against the cruel stepmother was just beginning, but for the first time in months, he felt truly hopeful about the future. The days that followed the hospitalization were an emotional roller coaster that tested all the limits of his endurance. The beggar girl remained in the pediatric ICU, connected to machines that monitored every beat of her fragile heart, while he divided his time between the hospital and his home, trying to maintain some normalcy for his daughter. The medical team had confirmed that the congenital heart condition was more complex than initially diagnosed. The girl's heart had developed serious structural problems that would require not one, but 2 consecutive surgeries, with a recovery period that could extend for months. "It's an extremely delicate case," explained the pediatric cardiologist during a meeting that included the entire medical team responsible for the treatment. "Prolonged malnutrition and lack of prior medical care have significantly compromised her ability to recover." "But will she survive?" he asked, his voice choked with the emotion he had been trying to control for days. "With proper treatment and great care, yes, but it will be a long and difficult journey. And we need to be honest. There are significant risks at every stage of the process." During this period of medical uncertainty, his daughter demonstrated a maturity and compassion that impressed him daily. Every morning, she insisted on accompanying him to the hospital, bringing colorful drawings and small toys for the girl she had not yet met personally. "When she wakes up, I want her to know she has a sister waiting for her," his daughter said one morning, while carefully coloring a drawing of 2 girls playing in a garden. "Why do you want so much to be her sister?" he asked, curious about the emotional connection his daughter had developed with a stranger. "Because you get happy when you talk about her. And because Mom always said that family is about loving people who need love," she replied, with the deep simplicity that only children possess. The reference to his deceased wife hit him deeply. During months of depression, he had forgotten the values she had tried to teach him, focusing only on his own pain. Now, through the eyes of his daughter, he could see that saving the beggar girl was exactly the kind of thing his wife would have done without hesitation. It was during the 2nd week of hospitalization that the legal situation became dramatically complicated. The cruel stepmother had hired an attorney and was officially contesting his temporary custody of the girl, alleging kidnapping and interference in family matters. "She's arguing that you removed the child from her legal guardianship without a court order," his own attorney explained during an emergency meeting at the hospital. "And technically, she's right. We could face serious complications if this goes to court. She was letting the girl die," he protested. "Any sensible judge will understand that it was a medical emergency." "Maybe, but the legal system doesn't always work sensibly. And this woman seems to have connections we didn't expect." The revelation that the stepmother had organized legal support was a shock that forced him to recognize that he was dealing with something much larger than a simple situation of child neglect. The investigators he had hired confirmed his worst suspicions. There was an organized network that exploited vulnerable children, and the stepmother was just a small piece in a much larger operation. During this period of legal battle, something extraordinary happened at the hospital. The beggar girl finally woke up from her prolonged sedation, and the first person she saw when she opened her eyes was his daughter, sitting beside the bed with a children's storybook. "Hi," said the beggar girl with a weak but clear voice, her large eyes focusing on the unfamiliar but friendly face. "Hi, I'm your sister," his daughter replied naturally, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "My daddy told me about you." The encounter between the two girls was a moment of pure magic that dispelled months of tension and internal conflict. They connected instantly, as if they were blood sisters who had been separated and finally reunited. "Do you have the same daddy as me?" asked the beggar girl, confused but interested. "Now, yes," his daughter replied with absolute conviction. "He's going to take care of both of us." When he entered the room and saw the two girls talking animatedly, with their daughters holding hands through the bars of the hospital bed, he felt he had finally found the purpose he had been seeking since the accident that changed his life. But the happiness of that moment was interrupted by the arrival of two bailiffs, accompanied by the cruel stepmother and her lawyer. They were carrying a court order that demanded the immediate transfer of the beggar girl to an orphanage run by the state, while the matter of custody was resolved in the courts. "This child was illegally removed from the custody of her legal guardian," declared the stepmother's lawyer, "and this irregular situation needs to be corrected immediately." "She was dying," he protested. "Look at her. See the state she was in when I brought her here." "That will be determined by an official investigation," the bailiff replied. "But for now, the court order is clear." The idea that the girl would be removed from the hospital before completing her treatment, potentially putting her life at risk again, awakened in him a fury he didn't know he possessed. He had spent his entire life wielding money and influence in a civilized, respectful manner. Now, for the first time, he was prepared to use every ounce of his power aggressively and ruthlessly. "You're not taking her," he stated, his voice low but laced with a threat that made everyone in the room take notice. "I have the resources to keep this battle in the courts for years, and I will spend every last dime of my fortune to ensure this child gets the treatment she needs." "Are you threatening officers of the court?" the stepmother's attorney asked with a taunting grin. "I'm making a promise," he retorted, "a promise that I will fight for this girl with everything I have. And I have plenty." That evening, after the bailiffs had temporarily left to reassess the situation due to his legal threats and the emergency interventions from his own legal team, he sat beside the two girls now sleeping in the same hospital bed, their small hands still intertwined. For the first time in over 2 years, since the loss of his wife, he felt like he had a real family again. And he was willing to spend every dollar of his fortune, accumulated through years of smart investments, to protect this family that fate had placed in his path. The legal battle intensified as disturbing discoveries began to surface about the cruel stepmother's past and the child exploitation ring she represented. The private investigators he had hired brought forth evidence that completely changed the nature of the case. "We've found some very interesting financial records," the lead investigator reported during a discreet meeting at the city's most prestigious law firm. "The woman identifying herself as the girl's stepmother has been receiving regular payments from several different sources over the past 2 years. "What kind of payments?" he asked, although he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "Monthly deposits from different individuals, always in amounts that suggest services being rendered. And there's something even more troubling. She has at least 6 other children under her care, all in similar situations." The revelation that there were other children being exploited transformed his determination into something far broader than personal protection. It wasn't just about saving one girl anymore. It was about dismantling a criminal operation that was destroying the lives of innocent children. During this period of intensive investigation, the girl was slowly recovering in the hospital. The first surgery had been successful, but the doctors were cautious about her long-term prognosis. Her heart condition was improving, but the effects of prolonged malnutrition were still evident. "She needs to gain significant weight before the second surgery," the cardiologist explained, "and that will require not only proper nutrition, but also emotional stability. Stress could severely compromise her recovery." The constant presence of his daughter had become a crucial element in the healing process, The two girls had developed a connection that went beyond the typical friendship between children. It was as if they had found the sisters they always knew they should have had. "She taught me how to make paper birds," his daughter said one afternoon, showing him a colorful collection of origami they had created together. "And I taught her how to read some words." "You're both helping each other grow," he observed, seeing how his own daughter had matured emotionally since taking on the role of older sister. It was during the 3rd week of hospitalization that they received an unexpected visit that would change everything again. A middle-aged man, dressed formally and carrying a briefcase, arrived at the hospital asking to speak with him about matters related to the girl admitted. "My name is Dr. Fernando Santos, and I'm a physician from the clinic where the girl's biological mother was a patient before she passed away," the man said, handing him a business card. "There's information about her medical history that may be relevant to the current treatment." "The biological mother?" he asked, confused. "The stepmother never mentioned any details about this." "Because she probably didn't want you to know the truth," the doctor replied with a grave expression. "The girl's mother wasn't just anyone. She was, well, she was someone you knew." Dr. Santos's following words unleashed a revelation that left him utterly floored. The girl's biological mother had been a woman named Meredith Hayes, who had worked as a volunteer nurse at several city hospitals, including the one where his own wife had received treatment after her accident. "Meredith cared for your wife during her final weeks," the doctor explained. "She always spoke about how much she admired the love you shared and how she wished her daughter could grow up in a family with that kind of connection." The connection between the families wasn't coincidence, it was fate. The woman who had cared for his wife during her final moments had left behind a daughter who was now in his care. It was as if his wife was sending a message through time, uniting their lives in a way that transcended rational understanding. "There's something else," Dr. Santos continued. "Meredith left behind some personal belongings at the hospital, including a sealed letter addressed to whoever cares for my daughter. We thought you should read it." The letter, written in delicate handwriting on hospital stationery, contained words that brought tears streaming down his face. "If someone is reading this, it means I wasn't able to raise my little girl as planned. I hope she has found a family who loves her as I loved her. During my work here, I met many families shattered by grief, but I also saw the transformative power of true love. If my daughter is being cared for by someone who knows that love, then I can depart in peace knowing she will have the life I always dreamed for her." At that moment, all questions about his motivations for helping the girl vanished. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't guilt, it wasn't moral obligation. It was a profound connection that had been established through love and loss, creating a family that transcended biological ties. When he showed the letter to his daughter, she listened with earnest attention before making a comment that perfectly summarized the situation. "So our sister's mommy knew our mommy too. That means we were a family all along, we just didn't know it." His daughter's childlike wisdom touched something deep in his heart. For months he had tortured himself, trying to understand why he felt so connected to the girl. Now he knew that this connection was real and had roots that went far beyond the chance encounter in the rain. Armed with this new information and with the mounting evidence about the stepmother's criminal operation, his legal team began to build a case that would not only secure his custody of the girl, but also expose the entire child exploitation ring. "We now have grounds to turn this from a custody dispute into a criminal investigation," his lead attorney explained. "And with the resources you're willing to invest, we can ensure that all the children being exploited are saved." That night, as he watched the two girls sleep peacefully in the hospital room, he made a silent promise not only to his new family, but to all the vulnerable children who were suffering in silence throughout the city. He would use all his fortune, all his influence, all his power to ensure that no child had to endure what his little family had faced. The battle was far from over, but now he knew exactly what he was fighting for. Not just for one girl, but for justice, for family, and for the memory of a wife who had planted seeds of love that continued to grow even after her passing. The operation to dismantle the child exploitation ring began 3 days after the discovery of the letter. Using his vast fortune and business connections, he had assembled a team that included the best private investigators, attorneys specializing in crimes against children, and even former federal agents now working in the private sector. We've identified at least 15 children being held in 5 different locations throughout the city, the operations coordinator reported during a meeting in the luxurious penthouse apartment that had become the mission's unofficial headquarters. All between the ages of 3 and 8, all in deplorable conditions. "How are we going to get them out of there without alerting those responsible?" he asked, studying photographs that showed seemingly normal houses where children were being held as prisoners. "We're going to need simultaneous coordination at all locations," the former federal agent explained. "And we'll need the support of local authorities, even if some of them may be compromised." During this period of intensive planning, the girl continued her recovery in the hospital. The second surgery had been scheduled for the following week, and the doctors were optimistic about her chances of full recovery. But more important than her physical health was the emotional transformation that was taking place. "She's starting to smile," his daughter observed during one of their daily visits. "And today she asked me if we could plant flowers when she gets out of the hospital." The idea that the girl was making plans for the future, thinking about normal childhood activities like planting flowers, was a sign that she was finally healing not only physically, but emotionally as well. It was during this crucial week that the cruel stepmother made her most desperate move. She appeared at the hospital with a temporary court order, claiming that there was new evidence proving her fitness as the girl's guardian. "This temporary custody arrangement ends now," she declared, flanked by her attorney and 2 bailiffs. "The girl is coming with me today. She's scheduled for heart surgery in 3 days, he protested, feeling panic rise in his chest. Moving her now could be fatal. "That's the problem of the doctors at the public hospital, where she should be treated," the stepmother replied with calculated cruelty. "This private clinic is too expensive for someone in our financial situation." The implicit threat was clear. She planned to remove the girl from the best hospital in the city and transfer her to a public institution where she would not receive the specialized care needed. It was a deliberate attempt to use the child's health as a weapon in the legal battle. At that moment, he made a decision that would change everything irrevocably. He picked up the phone and made a call he had been avoiding for weeks. "District Attorney Wallace, this is about that child exploitation case we discussed. I'm ready to turn over all the evidence we've collected." Today, the call to the district attorney's office was the beginning of a sequence of events that unfolded with stunning rapidity. In less than 6 hours, an official task force had been formed, including specialized prosecutors, official investigators, and even representatives from international child protection organizations. "The evidence you've collected is sufficient for us to prosecute everyone involved, for child trafficking, child exploitation, and a dozen other federal crimes," the prosecutor explained during an emergency meeting at the hospital itself. "But we need to act quickly before they destroy evidence or move the children." The rescue operation was scheduled to take place in the early hours of the following day, simultaneously at all identified locations. But first, they needed to ensure that the girl was legally protected from any attempt at forced removal. "I'm going to seek an emergency protective order," said the lead attorney, arguing that moving the girl before surgery would constitute a life-threatening risk. That should give us at least a week of protection. That night, While the cruel stepmother was forced to leave the hospital without the girl due to the new court order, he sat beside the two children he now considered his daughters. Both slept peacefully, their small hands intertwined through the bars of the hospital bed. "Daddy," his biological daughter whispered, half awake, "will everything be okay tomorrow?" "Yes, sweetheart," he replied, stroking her hair. "Tomorrow, we start a new life, all of us together." The rescue operation began at 5 in the morning, coordinated by teams that he had funded, but now operated under official government authority. Through real-time reports, he followed each step of the mission from the hospital. Location 1, 3 children recovered, 2 people arrested, came the first report. Location 2, 4 children found, critical conditions, ambulances en route, came the second. One by one, the reports arrived, painting a horrifying picture of the extent of the criminal operation, but also bringing hopeful news of children being saved. The cruel stepmother herself was arrested at her home at 6:30 in the morning, along with documents proving her participation in the larger exploitation ring. Among the papers found were detailed financial records showing exactly how much money she had extorted from various victims over the course of 2 years. She wasn't just a middleman, the lead investigator reported. She was one of the main organizers, responsible for recruiting vulnerable children and connecting them with interested clients. When the final results of the operation were compiled, the numbers were simultaneously devastating and hopeful. 15 children rescued, 8 adults arrested, and a criminal network that spanned 3 states dismantled. More importantly, all the rescued children were now under official protection and receiving appropriate medical and psychological care, funded by a trust he had established specifically for that purpose. That afternoon, when he returned to the hospital after tracking the latest developments in the operation, he found the girl awake and sitting up in bed, talking animatedly with his daughter about the storybooks they had been reading together. "Are the other children safe now?" she asked when she saw him enter the room. The question surprised him. Even in her own vulnerable condition, she was concerned about other children she didn't even know personally. It was a demonstration of empathy and kindness that confirmed everything he had felt about her special character since their first meeting in the rain. "Yes, sweetheart," he replied, sitting down beside the bed. "They're all safe now, and you'll never have to worry about bad people again." At that moment, surrounded by the 2 girls who had become his family, he understood that he had used his fortune in the most meaningful way possible, not just to accumulate more wealth, but to save lives and create a better future for children who deserved every opportunity the world could offer. The months that followed the dismantling of the criminal ring were a period of profound transformation for the entire family that had been formed by the extraordinary circumstances. The girl's second surgery was a complete success, and her recovery exceeded all medical expectations. But more important than her physical healing was the emotional transformation that was taking place in all of them. The luxurious penthouse apartment had been completely renovated to accommodate 2 children. The room that had remained untouched since the accident was transformed into a cheerful and welcoming space, decorated with drawings by the girls themselves and filled with books, toys, and mementos of the adventures they were experiencing together. "Dad, can I show her the pictures of Mom?" his biological daughter asked one afternoon, referring to the collection of photographs he had kept locked away for so long. "Of course, honey. She's part of our family now too," he replied, realizing how natural it had become to talk about his deceased wife in a fond rather than painful way. When the girls sat together looking at the photographs, something magical happened. His daughter told stories about the mother she had lost, while the girl listened with fascinated attention, asking questions about the woman she had never met, but who had cared for her own mother. "She looks very kind," the girl commented, looking at a picture where his wife was smiling in the garden of their old house. "Just like my mommy told me the good people in the hospital were." They knew each other, you know, his daughter said, and then explained the whole connection between their families in a simple and beautiful way that made both children feel even more connected. During this period of family healing, he was also undergoing profound changes in his perspective on life and purpose. The fortune he had accumulated through years of smart investments in stocks, funds, and even cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin was being channeled into causes that really mattered. He established a foundation dedicated to the protection of vulnerable children, funded the creation of specialized shelters for victims of exploitation, and even invested in training programs to identify and prevent child abuse situations. His fortune was being used to create systemic changes that would protect future generations. "You've transformed into a completely different person," his attorney observed during a meeting about the final legal aspects of the adoption case. "2 years ago, you were a man destroyed by loss. Now you're someone who's saving lives." "The girls saved me first," he replied, looking through the office window toward the park where his daughters were playing with the nanny. "They taught me that family isn't about blood or circumstances. It's about choosing to love unconditionally." It was during the 6th week after the rescue operation that they received an unexpected visit that brought surprising news about the impact of their actions. District Attorney Wallace arrived at the penthouse apartment with a briefcase full of documents and an expression of deep satisfaction. "I wanted you to know the final results of the investigation," he said, sitting down in the living room where the girls were coloring drawings on the floor. "Thanks to the evidence you provided and the funding of the operation, we managed to dismantle not only the local ring, but connect it to similar operations in other states." "Other children were saved?" asked the girl, looking up from her drawing with genuine interest. 43 children in total," the district attorney replied with a smile, "and they are all now in loving foster families or specialized institutions that will help them recover." The news that their actions had resulted in the rescue of dozens of other children was a moment of profound realization for the entire family. They had started by trying to save one girl, but they ended up creating a wave of change that was protecting children across multiple states. During this period, the girl was also making important discoveries about her own identity and history. Through the documents recovered during the investigations, it was possible to reconstruct parts of her past that had been obscured by neglect and exploitation. "We've discovered her real name," the social worker explained during a follow-up visit. "And we found records that her mother had left a small inheritance in a bank account that was never accessed." "An inheritance?" he asked, surprised. "It's not a lot of money, but it's significant symbolically. Her mother had saved every penny she could, apparently planning to give it to her daughter when she grew up. It's as if she knew she wouldn't be there, but she wanted to make sure her daughter had something of her." When they told the girl about the inheritance left by her mother, she had a reaction that deeply touched everyone present. Instead of asking about the money, she wanted to know if there was a letter or personal message. "She didn't leave a letter, but she left something even more special," the social worker said, taking a small wooden jewelry box from the briefcase. This was with the bank documents. Inside the box were photographs of the girl as a baby, a small gold chain with a heart-shaped pendant, and a handwritten note that simply said, "To my precious daughter, who will always be loved, wherever she is." The emotion of that moment was overwhelming for everyone present. The girl held the chain against her chest and cried tears that were simultaneously of sadness for the mother she had lost, and of joy for knowing that she had been loved from the beginning. "Now I have 2 families who love me," she said through her tears. "The family that's gone and the family that's here." That night, after both girls had fallen asleep in their new rooms, decorated with care and love, he sat in his office reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had led to that moment. Less than a year before, he was a man destroyed by loss, isolated from the world, and consumed by depression. Now he was the father of two extraordinary girls, had saved dozens of other children, and rediscovered a purpose in life that went far beyond simply accumulating wealth. The fortune he possessed finally had real meaning. It wasn't just numbers in bank accounts or investments in stocks that generated dividends. It was a powerful tool for creating positive changes in the world. Every dollar invested in financial applications now served the greater purpose of protecting vulnerable children and building a better future. But more important than any monetary value was the family that had been formed through adversity and unconditional love. The two girls had become true sisters, united not only by the circumstances that had brought them together, but by the genuine affection they had developed for each other. As he watched the stars through the window of his apartment, he made a silent promise to his deceased wife, to the girl's biological mother, and to all the children who had been saved through their actions. He would continue to use all available resources to ensure that no child had to face alone the horrors that his little family had overcome. True wealth was not in his financial assets, but in the family he had chosen to build, and in the difference they were making in the lives of others. And that was a fortune that no circumstance could take from him. The preparations for the official adoption process were proceeding smoothly when an unexpected discovery changed everything in a way that no one could have foreseen. It was during the final analysis of the girl's medical documents needed to complete the legal paperwork that the hospital's geneticist made an observation that initially seemed just a scientific curiosity. "There are some interesting anomalies in her blood tests," Dr. Holloway commented during a routine consultation. "Genetic markers that are relatively rare in the general population, but that appear in certain families with specific medical histories." "What kind of anomalies?" he asked, although he didn't expect it to be anything relevant beyond the medical aspect. "Mainly related to blood type and some compatibility factors. These are characteristics that usually indicate descent from very specific family groups. In fact, they are similar to the markers we saw in your biological daughter's tests." The doctor's casual observation planted a seed of curiosity that grew during the following days. It wasn't uncommon for unrelated children to share similar genetic characteristics, but the specificity of the similarities was intriguing. During a conversation with his attorney about the final aspects of the adoption, he decided to mention the doctor's observation. "Would it be possible to do a paternity test just to clarify any legal issues that might arise in the future?" he asked, hoping it was just an administrative formality. "Of course, it's even recommended in complex adoption cases like this," the attorney replied. "It can help avoid future legal complications if there are any questions about the family situation." The test was done routinely, with samples collected discreetly during one of the girls' regular medical exams. No one expected significant results. It was just a legal precaution to strengthen the adoption process. During the week of waiting for the results, family life continued its new normal. The girls had begun attending a private school near the apartment, where they quickly became inseparable and popular among their peers for their genuine friendship and their ability to include other children in their games. "They are like two parts of a whole," the teacher observed during a parent-teacher conference. "It's rare to see such a natural connection between sisters, especially considering they come from such different backgrounds." The teacher's observation echoed something he had noticed since the first meeting between the girls in the hospital. There was a natural synchronicity in their interactions, a way of complementing each other that went beyond what would be expected even among biological sisters who grew up together. It was on a sunny Thursday that the lab called with the test results. The technician's voice sounded confused when he delivered the information that would change everything forever. "Sir, there's something in the results that needs to be discussed in person," the man said. "Could you come to the lab today? And it would be best to bring your attorney as well." The urgency in the technician's voice set off an alarm in his mind. Paternity results were typically simple, positive or negative. The need for a personal discussion suggested something much more complex. At the lab, the chief geneticist greeted them with an expression of professional perplexity. On the table in front of him was a folder with graphs and analyses that seemed much more elaborate than a simple paternity test. "Gentlemen, in 20 years of doing this type of analysis, I've never seen anything like it," the specialist began. "The results are technically impossible, but they have been confirmed 3 times with different samples." "How so impossible?" the attorney asked, leaning forward. "The test shows that the girl is not your direct biological child," the geneticist explained. "But there are genetic markers that indicate a very close family relationship. Specifically, the data suggest that she is your biological niece." The silence that followed was deafening. He tried to process the information that seemed to contradict everything they knew about the girl's history. "How is that possible?" he finally asked. "There's only one logical explanation," the specialist continued. "The girl's biological mother would have to be the sister of someone directly related to you. And given that we know your deceased wife had no children other than your daughter, the connection would have to come through her." The revelation struck like lightning. For months, he had felt an inexplicable connection with the girl, something that went beyond normal sympathy or compassion. Now he discovered that this connection had a real genetic basis. She was his deceased wife's niece. "That means she's my daughter's biological cousin?" he asked, still struggling to fully comprehend the implications. "Exactly. And more than that, it means your wife had a sister you didn't know about, someone who was probably given up for adoption or separated from the family as a child." The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together devastatingly clearly. The girl's biological mother, who had worked as a nurse and cared for his wife, was not just a compassionate stranger. She was his wife's long-lost sister, who had found a way to care for the family she never knew she had. "Meredith wasn't just a nurse who cared for my wife," he murmured, the realization growing in his mind. "She was my wife's sister." And she recognized something familiar in her, even without knowing exactly what. That afternoon, when he returned home with the most extraordinary revelation of his life, he found the 2 girls playing in the apartment's indoor garden, their laughter echoing through the walls. He watched them with new eyes, looking for the physical similarities that now made complete sense. The way the girl smiled was identical to the smile his wife had when she was a child, visible in the old photographs he had saved. The way she tilted her head when she was concentrated was exactly like his wife's characteristic gesture. Even her eyes had the same shape and color, details he had subconsciously noticed but never managed to explain. "Girls, I need to talk to you about something very important," he said, sitting down on the floor beside them. "Is it about the adoption papers?" his biological daughter asked. "The teacher said we're soon going to be an official family on paper, too." "It's about that, yes. But it's something even more special," he replied, carefully choosing his words. "We've discovered that you two aren't just sisters at heart. You're real cousins." The explanation that followed was adapted for childlike comprehension, focusing on the magical aspect of the discovery rather than the traumatic details about family separations and difficult circumstances. "So my mommy in heaven and her mommy in heaven were sisters?" asked the girl, her eyes shining with fascination. "Exactly. And they met before they passed, even without knowing they were sisters. As if love was stronger than any separation." The girls processed this information with the natural acceptance that only children possess for concepts that adults would consider impossible or excessive coincidences. "That means we were always family, even before we met each other?" his daughter asked. "It means you were destined to meet," he replied, feeling tears of joy stream down his face. "And that I was destined to take care of both of you." That night, after the girls had fallen asleep in their rooms, he sat alone contemplating the miracle that had unfolded over the past year. What had begun as a chance encounter in the rain had revealed itself to be a family connection that transcended coincidence or fate. His wife, even after her passing, had found a way to bring her lost family back home. Through circumstances that seemed impossible, she had reunited his daughter with the cousin she had never known, and given him the opportunity to care for the niece he never knew existed. The fortune he possessed, all the investments in stocks and Bitcoin, all the applications that generated dividends, none of that compared to the real wealth he had discovered. A family that was miraculously reunited through love, loss, and the second chance that life sometimes offers when we least expect it. The discovery of the family connection completely transformed the dynamics of their lives, but in an unexpectedly challenging way. In the days following the genetic revelation, he found himself facing complex emotional questions that he hadn't anticipated. Knowing that the girl was his wife's niece brought a dimension of responsibility and guilt that almost crushed him. During a session with the psychologist, he had begun seeing to deal with the emotional complexity of the situation. These questions came to the fore in a devastating way. "I should have realized," he said, his voice laden with self-reproach. "There were signs. The way Meredith cared for my wife was different, more personal, and the comments she made about family and lost connections. You can't blame yourself for not having information that was deliberately hidden," Dr. Peterson replied. "Meredith probably didn't consciously know that your wife was her sister. Children separated in infancy rarely retain clear memories of siblings. But if I had paid more attention, if I had been more emotionally present at the time, maybe I could have discovered the connection. Maybe I could have saved Meredith too." Survivor's guilt had multiplied exponentially. It wasn't just about not having helped a struggling employee. It was about failing to recognize and protect his wife's extended family. During this period of internal emotional turmoil, the girls were living their own journey of discovery. The news that they were biological cousins had initially left them euphoric, but gradually they began to ask deeper questions about their origins and about why their mothers had been separated. "Daddy, why was our family broken?" the girl asked one night, using the word daddy for the first time to refer to him, a development that deeply moved him even amidst his internal turmoil. "Sometimes families are separated by difficult circumstances," he responded carefully, "but the important thing is that we're together again now." "But could it happen again?" she insisted, revealing deep fears that the discovery had awakened. The question struck at the heart of his own concerns. The revelation of the family connection had created complicated legal questions about the adoption. Some lawyers argued that being his wife's biological niece, the girl had an automatic right to his custody. Others suggested that this could complicate the process, creating unwanted legal precedents. It was during a meeting with the social worker responsible for the case that these complications became evident. The discovery of the biological relationship fundamentally changes the legal nature of the situation, Dr. Ramirez explained. "We're no longer dealing with a simple adoption, but with a question of family guardianship, and that can open doors for challenges from other distant relatives who may emerge." "What kind of challenges?" he asked, feeling anxiety grow. "Well, if Meredith had a sister, it's possible that there are other family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. If any of them show up claiming rights over the girl, the case could become significantly complicated." The possibility that other people could try to separate his newly formed family terrified him. For months, he had struggled to save the girl from an abusive situation. Now, the very discovery that should have made everything simpler was creating new dangers. It was in this moment of heightened anxiety that he received an unexpected call that would change everything once again. It was from an elderly woman who identified herself as Mary Hayes, claiming to be the biological grandmother of both his wife and Meredith. "I saw the news stories about the case in the newspapers," said the fragile but determined voice. And I recognized the photographs. Those are my granddaughters, and now I've discovered I have a great-granddaughter who needs to know her real history. The meeting with Mary Hayes was arranged to take place at her home, with all the necessary legal precautions in place. When the 78-year-old woman arrived, accompanied by her own attorney and carrying a box of old photographs, it was immediately clear that she truly knew the history that everyone had been trying to reconstruct. "Your wife and Meredith were twins," she revealed, spreading black and white photographs on the table. "They were born in 1985, during a very difficult time in my life. I was very young, alone, with no resources to care for two children. The photographs showed two identical babies, then two small children playing together, and finally adoption papers confirming that the sisters had been separated when they were only 3 years old. I managed to keep one of them, who became your wife, but Meredith went to a family in another state. I spent 50 years trying to find them again," the elderly woman continued, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Why were they separated?" he asked, although he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "Extreme poverty and lack of social support. The family that adopted Meredith promised to keep in touch, but then they moved without leaving an address. Your wife grew up with me until she was 18, when she left to study and build her own life." The revelation that his wife and Meredith were twins explained the inexplicable connection they had felt when they met in the hospital. Even without conscious memories of each other, the genetic and emotional bond had been strong enough to create a special connection during the medical care. "And now?" he asked, fearing that the grandmother's appearance meant yet another battle for the girl's custody. "Now, I want to meet my great-granddaughter and make sure she grows up knowing about her family," Mary Hayes replied. "But I don't want to take her away from you. I can see that she is happy and safe. I just want to be a part of her life." That afternoon, when the girls met their great-grandmother, something magical happened. Mary Hayes had brought more photographs, including some of his wife as a child, that were practically identical to the girls' photos at the same age. "You are exactly like your mothers when they were little," the elderly woman said, hugging both girls. "Two generations of cousins who are like sisters." During the weeks that followed, Mary Hayes became a regular presence in their lives, not as a threat to family stability, but as a bridge to a history that had been lost. She told stories about the twins' childhood, shared family traditions, and most importantly, gave the girls a sense of historical continuity that had been interrupted for decades. "She completes our family," his biological daughter observed one night, after spending an entire Sunday listening to her great-grandmother's stories. "It's like all the broken pieces are coming back together again." But it was the girl who made the most profound observation about the whole situation. "Daddy, I think the mummies in heaven planned all this. They knew we needed to find each other." The simplicity and wisdom of her observation touched something deep in his heart. For months, he had tortured himself trying to understand the impossible coincidences that had brought his family together. Now, through the eyes of a 4-year-old, he could see that perhaps they weren't coincidences, but a plan carefully orchestrated by two sisters who had found a way to reunite their families even after they were gone. That night, as he watched his two daughters sleep peacefully in their rooms, he finally found peace with all the emotional complexity of the past months. The discovery of the family connection hadn't complicated their lives. It had completed a circle that had been broken by tragic circumstances decades ago. His fortune, all the wealth accumulated through careful investments in stocks and financial applications, had found its noblest purpose, not only protecting his newly discovered family, but honoring the memory of two sisters who never gave up trying to find each other, even when the circumstances seemed impossible. 1 year after the discovery that changed everything, life had found a perfect balance that none of them would have imagined possible. The country house they bought in the suburbs of the chaotic metropolis had become the ideal setting for a family that had grown organically through love and determination. The garden that the girls had dreamed of planting flourished beyond all expectations. Flowers of every color created a living tapestry around the house, while two fruit trees, planted in memory of the twin mothers, offered shade and sweet fruits during the warmer months. "Daddy, the flowers grew exactly like Grandma Mary said they would," observed the girl who was no longer a street urchin, but his daughter by right and by heart. At 5 years old, she had transformed completely, physically robust and emotionally secure, with a smile that lit up any room. "Grandma Mary knows a lot about making things grow," he replied, watching her and her sister, for that was how they referred to each other now, playing among the flowers they had planted together. The official adoption had been finalized 6 months earlier, in a ceremony that brought together the entire extended family that had been miraculously reconstituted. Mary Hayes, now affectionately called Grandma Mary by the girls, had moved into an apartment near the new house, creating a network of family support that provided stability and historical continuity. The criminal proceedings related to the child exploitation ring had resulted in severe convictions for everyone involved. The cruel stepmother received a 15-year prison sentence, while other members of the organization faced similar penalties. More importantly, all 43 children rescued during the operation had been placed in loving foster families or specialized institutions that guaranteed their future well-being. "Sometimes I get letters from the other children who were saved," his youngest daughter said during a family lunch. "They tell about their new families and about how happy they are now." The connection she maintained with the other victims of the criminal scheme had become a source of strength and purpose for the entire family. Through the foundation he had established, they continued to support not only these specific children, but develop prevention and protection programs that benefited hundreds of others. During this year of transformation, his own personal journey had been equally dramatic. The wheelchair, which for so long had represented limitation and a painful reminder of the accident, had become simply a tool for navigating the world, not a definition of his abilities or worth as a person. "You know you don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, including yourself," Mary Hayes said one afternoon, watching him play with the girls in the garden. "You saved 2 generations of our family. That's more than any man could be expected to do in a lifetime." The elderly woman's wisdom had become a constant source of perspective and peace. For decades, she had carried the guilt of having been forced to separate her twin granddaughters. Now, seeing the family that had emerged from the ashes of this old tragedy, she found redemption and purpose in her golden years. The wealth he had accumulated through smart investments continued to grow, but now it served purposes far greater than personal luxury. In addition to the foundation dedicated to child protection, he had established educational funds for all the rescued children, ensuring they would have access to the best resources available to build prosperous futures. "Our real wealth isn't in the banks," he said, during an interview for a documentary about the case that was being produced to raise awareness about child exploitation. "It's in the family we've built and in the lives we've been able to touch positively." The transformation of the girls during this year was the most impressive aspect of the entire journey. His biological daughter had evolved from a child traumatized by the loss of her mother into a confident and compassionate girl who had naturally assumed the role of protective older sister. She had found purpose in caring for her cousin sister and pride in being part of a story of rescue and redemption. The girl he had found on the streets, fragile and frightened, had blossomed into a vibrant and intelligent child who retained her natural goodness, but now possessed the security that comes from knowing she is loved unconditionally. Her heart, once weak and ill, now beat strong and healthy, pumping life through a body that finally received all the nutrition and care it deserved. "Daddy, can I tell you a secret?" she said one night, after her sister had fallen asleep and they were alone in the living room looking at family photo albums. "Of course, sweetheart. Sometimes I dream about my mommy and my sister's mommy, And in the dream, they are together and happy because they managed to make us a family. The simplicity and depth of her words touched something fundamental in his soul. For months, he had struggled with complex questions about destiny, coincidence, and meaning. A 5-year-old had found the answer he was seeking. Regardless of how or why it had happened, the result was a family united by love and strengthened by overcoming unimaginable adversity. On the eve of the 2nd anniversary of the day he found the girl in the rain, he organized a special celebration. It wasn't a celebration of sadness or trauma, but of transformation and hope. The entire extended family was present. Mary Hayes, the professionals who had helped during the journey, and even some of the other rescued children with their new families. "I want to make a little toast," said his youngest daughter, raising her glass of orange juice. "To the mommies in heaven who planned everything, to Daddy who saved us, to Grandma Mary who found us, and to my sister who taught me that family is about loving people." As everyone raised their glasses in that moment of collective gratitude, he looked around the table and saw not only his family, but a representation of how love can triumph over the most impossible circumstances. The girl he found trembling in the rain had become the unifying force that brought purpose, joy, and redemption to everyone around her. That night, after all the guests had left and the girls were sleeping in their rooms decorated with drawings of their own creations, he sat alone on the porch, contemplating the stars that shone over his new life. 2 years ago, he was a man shattered by loss, isolated from the world, and without hope that the future could bring anything other than pain. Now, he was the father of 2 extraordinary girls, the protector of dozens of other children, and the guardian of a fortune that finally had true meaning. The journey that had begun with a simple act of human kindness, helping a stranger fallen in the rain, had unfolded into a saga of rescue, discovery, and redemption that connected 2 generations and healed wounds that seemed incurable. As he watched the lights of the distant city, he made a final promise to the women who had departed this world, but whose love continued to guide his decisions. He would continue to use all available resources to protect vulnerable children, honor their memory through the family they had built together, and ensure that the lessons learned during this extraordinary journey were shared with the world. The story that had begun with a 4-year-old girl suffering in silence had transformed into a lesson about the transformative power of unconditional love, persistence in the face of adversity, and the human capacity to create family and meaning even when everything seems lost. In the end, true wealth was not measured in dollars, stocks, or Bitcoin investments, but in the quality of the relationships built and in the positive impact left on the world. And by that measure, he had become the richest man he knew. If you liked this wonderful story, please comment, giving a score from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.